Chapter 1. The sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of the Oakwood Parish Hall, casting floral shadows on linen tablecloths and polished teacups. It was the kind of bright spring afternoon where nothing terrible could possibly happen, except, of course, it did. It was the annual ladies' spring tea in the village of Oakwood Ridge, and nearly every respectable woman from the parish had gathered for lemon scones and polite gossip. The scent of freshly brewed Earl Grey and elderflower cordial hung sweet in the air, undercut only slightly by the unspoken tension seated at every table. Miss Marple sat near the windows, her knitting in her lap and a modest smile playing on her lips. She had accepted the invitation as she always did, with graceful good manners and genuine interest. But even before the teacups clinked, she had noticed it. Something was slightly off. A stiffness in voices, a flicker of hesitation between looks, the unnatural quiet between two women who were normally chatty. "Strawberry preserve, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Winifred Groves, hovering at the table with a crystal dish. "How very kind," Miss Marple replied, accepting it. "And how beautifully set everything is this year, Mrs. Groves. You've outdone yourself." "Ah, well, we do try," Winifred said, though her smile was brittle. Her gaze darted, just for a second, toward the far table, where Mrs. Letitia Blackwood sat like a porcelain statue in blue velvet. Letitia Blackwood, the widow with money, mystery, and enemies. She was not a frequent attendee of parish events, but she had arrived today, unannounced, and with the air of a queen inspecting her court. Her arrival had drawn a hush, the kind reserved for women whose presence always preceded a story, and rarely a pleasant one. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. At the far end of the hall, a sudden sound startled them all. A teacup shattered. It had slipped from the hands of young Lydia Farrow, the vicar's new secretary, whose pale cheeks flushed as she scrambled to pick up the pieces. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" Lydia exclaimed. Her hands trembled as she swept porcelain shards into her napkin. "I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Blackwood." Letitia did not respond at once. She simply looked at Lydia for a moment, longer than was polite, with a strange sort of detachment. "No harm done," she said at last, her voice cool as ice. "Though I do hope your nerves settle, Miss Farrow. They're not well suited to this line of work." Lydia muttered another apology and hurried off to the kitchen. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, not at the cracked cup, but at the cup that remained behind. Letitia Blackwood's cup, perfectly white, with just the faintest fracture down its handle, barely visible, but it hadn't been there earlier. "Now then," said Mrs. Groves cheerily, too loudly, "shall we begin the raffle?" But the tea never truly returned to its earlier cheer. Mrs. Blackwood did not stay long. She received her slice of almond cake, declined a second cup of tea, and left with a gloved hand resting lightly on the arm of her companion, Mr. Daniel Crowthorne, the solicitor from Hastings. By 5 o'clock, the chairs were being folded away, and crumbs swept from the floorboards. "Funny thing," said the vicar, Mr. Barnes, to Miss Marple as they lingered by the door. "Didn't expect Mrs. Blackwood today. She's never come to one of these in all my years here. Always found them beneath her, I suppose." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and yet she came." She did. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting bag. Nestled beside her needles was the napkin Lydia had used to collect the broken cup. Miss Marple had retrieved it herself. By accident, of course, or not entirely. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. By dusk, the spring light had softened into warm gold, draping Oakwood Ridge in a honeyed glow. The neat hedges, trimmed lawns, and tidy brick chimneys gave the illusion of harmony, an illusion Miss Marple had never fully trusted. She walked back to her cottage on Church Lane at a measured pace, pausing briefly to inspect a broken latch on the post box at the vicarage gate. Nothing in this village ever broke without someone behind it. A curious truth of life, she often thought. Damage rarely occurred by chance. Inside her cottage, the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint scent of lavender oil provided comfort. She placed the napkin with the broken teacup on her writing desk and studied it. One of the larger shards showed a hairline crack that extended unnaturally, as though stressed deliberately. Another piece bore a smudge, not tea, but something faintly sticky, dull amber under the light. Miss Marple folded the napkin again and turned to her window just as the church bell rang 6. The village remained quiet. Too quiet. By 7, the peace broke. News spread in whispers, first from a breathless schoolboy at the bakery, then by a constable's bicycle cutting fast through the high street, then by a phone call to Reverend Barnes, who, in turn, rang Miss Marple. Well, it seems Letitia Blackwood has died, the vicar said, his voice strangely flat. Heart failure. Or that's what the doctor said for now. She passed in her drawing room. Daniel Crowthorne found her. Unfortunate, Miss Marple replied calmly, though I imagine it will become more complicated than that. There was a pause on the line. Miss Marple, you don't think— I think, she said gently, that a cracked teacup and a sudden death in the same afternoon are rarely coincidence. Letitia Blackwood's home, Larkspur Hall, was evidence. Letitia Blackwood's home, Larkspur Hall, was a manor of sharp lines and silent rooms. Though not quite a recluse, Letitia had kept her home closed to the village for years. Tonight, it stood with its door ajar and windows flickering with gaslight. Miss Marple arrived quietly, greeted not by police, but by the local doctor, Henry Bellamy, who looked far too pale for a man so used to death. It's likely her heart, he said quickly, almost defensively. She'd mentioned discomfort last week, and she wasn't young. No, Miss Marple agreed. But I understand she was vigorous enough to attend the tea this afternoon. Dr. Bellamy nodded slowly, then added, Crowthorne found her slumped in the wing-back chair. I arrived shortly after. There were no signs of struggle. No, Miss Marple echoed again, looking past him. Letitia sat still in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, as though asleep. But her eyes, wide and glassy, spoke of something else. Something that startled her at the end. Allez, make arrangements for the coroner, Bellamy said quietly, retreating from the room. Left alone, Miss Marple moved only slightly, taking in the details. No overturned furniture, no spilled drink, no dishes out of place. But the tray on the sideboard was curious. 2 cups, one clean, one with residue, and an untouched almond cake. The same cake served at the parish tea. Her gaze dropped to the rug, a faint smear beneath the sideboard, not quite brown, sticky, the same amber she'd seen earlier. "Miss Marple." Daniel Crowthorne stood in the doorway, his tall frame blotting out the light. His voice was hoarse. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said politely. "No, of course not." He stepped in. "I imagine you'll be helping the inspector. Your reputation does precede you." "Oh, I never interfere. But I listen. And sometimes people say things they didn't mean to share." Daniel's smile faltered just slightly. "Yes, I suppose they do." She gestured toward the sideboard. "You poured the tea." "I did. She always preferred it weak. I used the same blend we had at the event. She brought it with her. A habit of hers. Didn't trust others to select her leaves. Very particular, wasn't she?" "You could say that," he replied, running a hand through his dark hair. "Letitia wasn't easy. Brilliant, but cold. She didn't like people, Miss Marple, least of all family. And yet you stayed close." "She paid my fees at Cambridge, and she liked control. Keeping people obligated suited her more than affection." Miss Marple looked once more at the untouched cake. "She declined dessert earlier, and yet here it sits." Daniel hesitated. "I offered, but she wasn't hungry. I think it was for appearance. She always kept things arranged." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Sometimes," she said, "things are arranged too carefully." By the time she left Larkspur Hall, the wind had picked up, and the village lamps flickered against the dark. She passed Lydia Farrow, walking hurriedly toward the vicarage, head down, clutching her cardigan too tightly for the mild night. Miss Marple paused. "Lydia." The young woman stopped, startled. Her face was pale again. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was just returning something to Mr. Barnes. At this hour? I forgot earlier. Just a book. For the sermon." Her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's. "May I ask, did Mrs. Blackwood say anything to you after the tea?" Lydia hesitated. "No, not really. Only that she hoped I'd find a more suitable line of work." "She frightened you?" "Yes, but she frightened everyone." As Lydia turned away, Miss Marple watched the shadows gather beneath the hedgerows. Another young woman with a reason to hate Letitia Blackwood, and quite possibly the opportunity. Chapter 3. Morning in Oakwood Ridge arrived with a brittle chill, despite the calendar's promise of spring. The postman delivered his letters more briskly than usual. The grocer arranged his produce with uncharacteristic silence, and even the sparrows on the chapel roof seemed to chirp with hesitation. Letitia Blackwood was dead, and though no one said the word murder, the idea perched silently behind every conversation. At the Oakwood General Store, whispers crackled louder than the receipts. "Well, she never was well liked," muttered Mrs. Edith Jennings to her neighbor as she weighed rhubarb. "All that money and not a charitable bone in her body. Always sneering. Heart failure, they say," replied Mr. Hopkin the cobbler. "But if you ask me, she was poisoned. They've not said it, but everyone's thinking it." "That young secretary was shaking like a leaf at the tea yesterday," Edith added, lowering her voice. "I saw her spill that cup and then vanish for ages. Trouble follows nerves like that." "Still," said Mr. Hopkin, "it'd take cunning to kill someone with tea, not just nerves." Behind the counter, the store owner, Mr. Fletch, glanced up. Well, don't forget Daniel Crowthorne was the one who made the tea. That was enough to pause the conversation. In Oakwood Ridge, the past was never far, and memories, especially resentments, never stayed buried for long. Detective Inspector Harwood arrived from Middleshire just before noon. A tall man with sharp shoes and sharper eyes. He wasn't fond of village crimes. They were rarely straightforward, and always full of secrets masquerading as manners. He found Miss Marple in the vicarage garden, trimming dead heads from the lilies. "Miss Marple," he greeted politely, "I'd be grateful for a word if you have time." "Of course," she said, setting her shears aside. "Shall we sit by the bee balm? The sun's just warming that bench." Harwood smiled faintly and followed. "I take it you've already formed an opinion?" he asked after a moment. "Oh, I never form opinions so early," Miss Marple replied. "But I do notice things," Miss Marple replied. "But I do notice things." "Such as?" "That Lydia Farrow was left alone in the kitchen for 10 minutes yesterday, where the tea service was kept. Setting Letitia Blackwood's teacup had a faint residue that did not appear to be cream or sugar. That the almond cake on her tray at home was untouched, though she brought it there deliberately." Harwood blinked. "You saw the body?" "I did. The doctor was kind enough to let me in." He sighed. "And now the whole village is in a frenzy." "That they are," Miss Marple said lightly. "But the truth tends to float, Inspector, even in murky waters." He considered that, then asked, "What's your impression of Mr. Crowthorne?" "Evasive, polished, but not transparent. I believe he cared for her, financially, if not emotionally. Still, men who are made dependent by women like Letitia seldom remain loyal forever." Harwood nodded. "We'll speak to him again." Miss Marple rose from the bench and dusted her hands on her apron. "If you'd like to understand Letitia Blackwood, speak to those who feared her, not to those who admired her." By late afternoon, the inspector had begun his interviews. Lydia Farrow was first. She arrived with her hair damp, as though she'd sure did just washed away the guilt. "I only served the cake," she insisted. "The tea was already poured when I brought the tray out." "And the cup that broke?" Harwood asked. "I dropped it. Clumsy hands, that's all. But Mrs. Blackwood, she made me nervous. Everyone knew she didn't want me at the vicarage." "What do you mean?" "She told Reverend Barnes to find someone older, someone more unassuming." Her words. "Veal," Inspector made a note. "Did you speak with her again after the tea?" "No, I went home." "Straight home?" But Miss Marple, seated just out of frame in the drawing-room, caught the tiny hesitation before Lydia said those words. Daniel Crowthorne, interviewed next at his office, presented himself with smooth composure. "She was an exacting woman," he admitted, "but not without kindness. She trusted me with her estate." "And what might you inherit?" Harwood asked. Daniel's expression flickered. "Only her gratitude. Letitia was meticulous. She left no doubts in her will." Miss Marple, observing once more from her seat, quietly scanned the room. Books arranged by height, not author. A clock that ticked a second faster than normal. A chessboard by the window. Game unfinished. She rose without a word and examined the chessboard. Daniel followed her gaze. "She hated chess," he said. "They said it was too honest a game." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, her hand brushing one of the pieces. The White Queen was missing. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once more in her cottage, rereading an old gardening journal and letting her thoughts simmer. Letitia Blackwood had enemies, yes, but no one profited clearly. Not yet. And then the letter arrived, slipped through the door with no return address. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single line in pencil, scrawled with nervous haste. She knew what I'd done. The cup wasn't meant for her. No name, no context, but enough to confirm two things. The death had not been natural, and the murderer had made a mistake. Chapter 4. The note sat on Miss Marple's table like a whisper that refused to fade. She knew what I'd done. The cup wasn't meant for her. No signature, no postmark, no envelope. Only the paper, thin and slightly smudged at the corner, as though handled in haste or fear. Miss Marple read it again, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her notebook between a pressed primrose and a list of parish birthdays. She had never trusted anonymous notes. They were either desperate or deceptive, and often both. Still, it had confirmed something crucial. Mrs. Blackwood's death was a mistake. The following morning, Inspector Harwood stood at the foot of Letitia Blackwood's grave, watching as the first clod of soil thudded onto the coffin. The burial had been arranged swiftly at Crowthorne's urging on account of Letitia's clear wishes. Miss Marple found the timing telling. The village hadn't even finished whispering, and already the matter was being put 6 feet under. Only a handful attended: Daniel Crowthorne, Reverend Barnes, Lydia Farrow, and 2 distant cousins, who seemed more annoyed than bereaved. They departed as soon as the final prayer ended, leaving the graveyard bathed in silence and pale light. "Do you believe in remorse, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked softly, as they walked back along the church path. "Professionally or personally?" "Both," he exhaled slowly. "I believe some people are capable of it. Others, most perhaps, are merely afraid of being caught." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lydia Farrow, who stood alone beneath the yew tree, arms crossed tightly, not crying, not even blinking. "I think someone regrets something," she said, "but not necessarily what you'd expect." Back at Larkspur Hall, Daniel Crowthorne was already arranging for Letitia's estate to be evaluated. "Efficient to a fault," muttered Constable Reginald as he watched from the gate. "She's not even cold." Harwood entered the study unannounced, Miss Marple trailing behind. "I'll keep this brief," the inspector said. "There was a note, anonymous. It suggests Mrs. Blackwood's death was not intended." Daniel looked up from a stack of documents. "Are you saying someone else was the target?" "Possibly," Harwood replied. "Or perhaps the cup was switched," Miss Marple interjected gently. "You said Mrs. Blackwood brought her own tea, blend to the gathering." "Yes. She always carried a little pouch in her handbag." "And where is that handbag now?" she asked. Daniel blinked. I don't know. I assumed the constable collected her things." Harwood turned to Reginald. "Did you?" The young constable shook his head. "We logged the contents of the drawing-room, sir. The handbag wasn't there." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then someone removed it. That's a very bold thing to do in the immediate aftermath of a death." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the parish hall. The tea service had already been packed away. but she asked Mrs. Groves for access to the storeroom. "Are you looking for something in particular?" Mrs. Groves asked, unlocking the door. "Not something. Someone," Miss Marple said. The small room smelled faintly of lavender polish and forgotten biscuits. Stacked chairs leaned against the walls, and a crate of mismatched cups sat half open. Miss Marple's fingers ran along the lip of the crate. One cup sat slightly apart from the others. Delicate white china, with a hairline fracture down the handle. Not the same as Lydia's broken cup. This one had been rinsed hastily, but not well. Traces of dark residue clung near the rim. She didn't touch it, just nodded. "Could I trouble you to call the inspector?" she asked Mrs. Groves, "and tell him to bring gloves." By twilight, Harwood had the cracked cup sealed in an evidence bag and sent for preliminary chemical testing in Middleshire. It would take a day or two. Miss Marple stood beside him outside the parish hall, the evening wind tugging gently at her scarf. "I dare say," she mused, "that the poison wasn't exotic. Letitia Blackwood would never drink anything unfamiliar. It had to be subtle. Familiar, tasteless, perhaps. Digitalis, Harwood offered. "Possibly," she said, "or something like it. But more importantly, whoever removed the teacup did so not to escape suspicion, but to remove evidence. It was panic, not planning. And the original cup? Still at Larkspur. Likely the one Letitia used later in the drawing room. Which means someone expected someone else to drink from that earlier cup." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And someone else did." That night, Lydia Farrow didn't go home. Miss Marple saw her from the lane, pacing beneath the vicarage light, her silhouette jittery and tense. Finally, she entered through the side door, remaining inside for over an hour. Miss Marple let herself into the vicarage kitchen 5 minutes after Lydia left. Reverend Barnes looked up from his writing desk. "She seems unwell," he said. "Tense. She dropped a hymn book on her way in and nearly cried over it. She's frightened." "Of what?" Miss Marple paused, then replied, "Of being found out, or of being believed." The vicar frowned. Miss Marple moved towards the ape desk. "May I?" He gestured toward the papers. "Please." Beneath the hymn drafts and Sunday notes was a slip of familiar paper, thin, grey-tinged, at the edge slightly torn. Miss Marple compared it silently to the anonymous note from the night before. Same grain, same smudge, same hand. Chapter 5. The next morning, a light rain had settled over Oakwood Ridge, muting the village into a grey hush, the kind of weather that made one reflect rather than act. Except, of course, for Miss Marple. By 9 o'clock, she stood on the threshold of Larkspur Hall once again. The air inside the grand house smelled of old smoke and bergamot. Daniel Crewthorne received her in the drawing-room, his shirt-sleeves rolled up, estate papers spread across the table like a battlefield. "I hope you'll excuse the clutter," he said with a strained smile. "There's rather more to settle than I'd imagined." "Death is seldom tidy," Miss Marple replied gently, settling into the same chair she had occupied 2 days earlier. She glanced at the sideboard. A new tea service had been laid out. Fresh pot, 2 cups. The same pattern as before, though this time no visible cracks. "How do you take your tea, Miss Marple?" "Just as it is, thank you. No sugar." He poured carefully, steady hands, practiced charm. "I must say," he continued, The village seems determined to see Letitia's death as dramatic. But I assure you, the post-mortem will confirm a weak heart. I'm sure the post-mortem will say many things, Miss Marple said, lifting her cup. But tea leaves, you know, can reveal just as much if one pays attention. Daniel chuckled. You mean fortune-telling? No, she said softly. I mean stains, residue, cracks. His smile faltered for half a beat. Just enough. She set her cup down without drinking. You know, she continued, it's curious. Letitia Blackwood was known for her rigid control. Her cup, her tea blend, even her temperature preference. Daniel said nothing. And yet, Miss Marple went on, you claim to have poured the tea yourself at Larkspur Hall the evening she died. Yes, as I said. But the cracked teacup she was found with had no lipstick, no hint of scent. She hadn't sipped from it at all, so perhaps she didn't trust it. He stood. What exactly are you implying? I'm suggesting she poured herself a second cup, from her own blend, later, after you left the room. His expression sharpened, which means, Miss Marple concluded, the poisoned cup was not meant for her at all. It was the first cup, the one you poured. By midday, Inspector Harwood had confirmed it. The cracked cup, retrieved from the parish hall, tested positive for a slow-acting cardiac glycoside, foxglove, derived from digitalis, tasteless in small doses, potent in tea. Miss Marple stood in his office. The results spread before them. She didn't drink it, Harwood muttered. She took it home but never touched it. Then later, she made her own tea, same blend, but with a different cup. She had no reason to be suspicious at the parish hall, Miss Marple said. But something about the tea unsettled her. Perhaps the taste was slightly wrong. Or perhaps she saw Lydia's hands shaking and simply preferred her own control. Harwood crossed his arms. Then who was the original target? Whoever usually drank from that particular cup, she said. It had a fracture, distinct if subtle. Someone may have recognized it subconsciously, or chosen it deliberately. She paused, then added, that note wasn't just a confession. It was a panic response. Someone realized the wrong person had died. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage again. Lydia Farrow was polishing the communion candlesticks in the nave, but her eyes flicked up with wary tension the moment Miss Marple entered. I wondered, Miss Marple said gently, if you've had trouble sleeping. Lydia hesitated a little. Guilt is a difficult pillow, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. I didn't poison her, Lydia said quickly. I know, Miss Marple replied. That silenced the young woman. Miss Marple walked slowly down the aisle, pausing beside the font. But you wrote the note. Lydia's shoulders sagged. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered. After she died, I panicked. I thought if anyone found out what I'd done, they'd think it was me. What had you done? Lydia bit her lip. At the tea, I switched the cup. I was nervous. I chipped mine earlier in the kitchen, and thought Mrs. Blackwood would scold me if she saw. So when the tray was unattended, I took hers, one from the cleaner set, and swapped it with mine. I didn't think it mattered. Miss Marple's eyes were kind. But someone else thought it mattered very much. Lydia nodded. When she died, I thought it was my fault, that I'd somehow killed her. You didn't, Miss Marple said. You merely disrupted someone else's plan." Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, thoughts clicking together like clockwork gears. She retrieved her notebook and opened it beside the fireplace. A name circled in the margin. Not Lydia, not Daniel, but someone else. Someone who had reason to be present in the storeroom, who had access to the cups before the tea was served. Someone who had no reason to be noticed, because they never left a strong impression. Miss Marple stared at the name, then underlined it. Chapter 6. The following morning brought clearer skies, but Oakwood Ridge remained under a silent pressure, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Behind the lace curtains and painted garden gates, speculation boiled. Someone had murdered Letitia Blackwood. Everyone now admitted it, just not out loud. In the vicarage kitchen, Miss Marple sipped tea made with her own leaves. She had long learned not to drink from other people's pots when murder was afoot. Across from her, Inspector Harwood reviewed Lydia's written statement. "So she admits switching the cups," he said, "but still claims she never tampered with anything." "She didn't," Miss Marple said with calm certainty. "Her panic was guilt-adjacent, not criminal, and she didn't have the mind for subtle poison. That takes coldness." Harwood set the paper down. "You said you had a name, someone you'd underlined." "I did." She tapped the corner of her notebook. "And it came to me, not during an interview, but during tea." He waited. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Consider. Who had consistent access to the storeroom? Who knew which cups were chipped, which had been retired to the back? Who would have a reason to be present and overlooked, because they were always present and always overlooked?" Harwood blinked. "You're not referring to one of the tea guests?" "No," she said. "I'm referring to the woman who sets the tables before the guests arrive." Mrs. Prudence Groves had been a fixture of the parish for 2 decades. Known for her hospitality and punctuality, she organized every tea event with the efficiency of a regimental officer. No one questioned her presence, because no one ever noticed it too closely. But this morning, when Miss Marple knocked on her cottage door, the hostess opened it with an expression too rehearsed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, drying her hands on her apron. "Such a sad week, hasn't it been?" "It has," Miss Marple agreed. "And I've found the only remedy for such sadness is distraction. May I come in?" Mrs. Groves hesitated, then stepped aside. The sitting room was modest, but clean, not a speck of dust. A half-knitted blanket lay folded with deliberate neatness beside a needlework basket. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the mantel. Photographs, a few china animals, and an ornate teaspoon in a glass case. She gestured toward it. "An award?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Groves said, smiling faintly. "Best in craft at the spring fair 2 years ago. Silver-plated. I polish it every week." "You must be very detail-oriented." "Comes from habit," Mrs. Groves replied. "Hard to keep everything running without a system." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, seating herself gently. "That's why I'm here, actually. I believe there's been a misplacement." Mrs. Groves frowned. "A teacup," Miss Marple said. "One with a fracture near the handle. You remember the one Lydia dropped?" "Of course," Mrs. Groves said quickly. "I found the pieces." "You found them?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I thought Lydia wrapped them in a napkin." Mrs. Groves blinked. "Ah, yes, of course. I meant I saw them afterward, when I cleaned." Miss Marple's silence was subtle but precise. Mrs. Groves sat down, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. "I've also been thinking," Miss Marple continued, "about the cracked cup in the storeroom, the one that wasn't part of the set you used for the tea. I believe it was placed there after the event, rather than before." Mrs. Groves swallowed. "Why would someone do that?" "To make it seem like the poison had always been in the ale storeroom. But I don't believe it was. I believe it was planted." Another pause. The clock on the mantel ticked on. "And I believe," Miss Marple added softly, "that Letitia Blackwood was not your intended victim." Mrs. Groves stared at her. "That's absurd. You've poured tea for years. You know the guests. You know who uses which cup. You know who always arrives early, and chooses the place nearest the window." Miss Marple rose and looked directly at her. "And that cup was always set there, wasn't it? For one specific person?" The silence deepened. Then Mrs. Groves's voice emerged, small, cracked, and full of rage disguised as calm. "She humiliated my sister," she whispered. Miss Marple said nothing. Letitia Blackwood accused her of theft, banished her from the parish. She was never the same after that, died within a year. I tried to speak to Mrs. Blackwood. She laughed in my face, called my sister clumsy and forgettable, as if her life meant nothing. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. "So you meant to kill Daniel Crowthorne?" Mrs. Groves looked up sharply. "Of course I did. He always sat by the window. He always took that cup. I'd made sure of it, week after week. I knew he'd come early, just as he always did. But this time," Miss Marple said gently, "Lydia switched it." Mrs. Groves's eyes shimmered, not with grief, but fury. She was meant to spill it. That was the plan. Not drink it, just spill it, so he'd take the second cup. I had it all arranged. 2 cups. One with a fault, one without. I thought, if she spilled hers, he'd take the back up. He always does. Miss Marple closed her notebook. "It's a dreadful thing," she said. "When someone dies you didn't mean to kill." Mrs. Groves didn't answer. Outside, the rain began again, quiet but steady. Chapter 7. By the time Miss Marple left Mrs. Groves's cottage, the rain had eased to a whisper. The air carried the scent of wet grass and lavender soap, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed a single mournful note. The confession lingered not as triumph, but as heaviness. Letitia Blackwood's death had been unintended, but no less deliberate. Justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely as simple as guilt and punishment. It lived in the folds of motive, regret, and consequence. Inspector Harwood met her on the path near the vicarage. She handed him her notes without a word. He read slowly, frowning, as he reached the final lines. Then he looked up. "She tried to kill Daniel Crowthorne?" Miss Marple nodded. "She orchestrated the poisoned cup to be his. She knew his habits, his timing, even his preference for a clean, unmarred cup. The plan was precise. But Lydia switched the cup without knowing the danger," Miss Marple finished. "And Letitia, ever particular, refused it once she noticed something wasn't quite right." Harwood's jaw tightened. "And now she's dead." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "because Mrs. Groves underestimated chaos. She assumed the world would unfold to her plan. But people aren't teacups. They don't stay where you place them. He sighed, glancing toward the churchyard. We'll need a formal statement. She'll be charged. Yes, Miss Marple said, though it won't bring Letitia back, nor her sister. He nodded slowly. You'll come to the hearing? No, she said. I've heard enough. Besides, there's still one matter unresolved. Harwood raised an eyebrow. Another? Of course, Miss Marple said, eyes narrowing slightly. You didn't think this were all about revenge, did you? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to Larkspur Hall, this time alone. Daniel Crowthorne greeted her with a guarded expression. I suppose you've come to deliver a moral, he said. I don't deliver morals, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. Only observations. He stepped aside to let her in. The drawing-room smelled of lemon polish and faint smoke. She tried to kill me, you know, he said bitterly, pouring a brandy. Mrs. Groves, because of Letitia. A grudge I knew nothing about. You benefited from Letitia's death, Miss Marple said lightly, glancing at the papers on his desk. Substantially, I imagine. He didn't deny it. But you were never in real danger, she continued, because you never intended to drink from that cup. His hand froze mid-pour. Miss Marple walked to the chessboard by the window, still set, still missing the white queen. I found it strange, she said, that you seemed unsurprised by Letitia's death. You had, after all, just poured her tea. If it were truly heart failure, you might have felt guilt, panic. But instead you moved quickly, securing the will, arranging the funeral. Very tidy. Daniel said nothing. You knew someone else had tampered with the cup, Miss Marple said, and you let it happen. He set the brandy down, more carefully than necessary. You can't prove that. I don't need to. Not in court. But in conscience, perhaps. Miss Marple reached into her bag and withdrew a small notebook. Recognize the crack on the cup, Daniel. You saw it before anyone else had touched the tray. You could have swapped cups again, prevented it, or warned someone. But you didn't. He met her eyes. She was a tyrant, Miss Marple. She kept me under her thumb for 10 years. You don't know what that's like. No, Miss Marple said calmly. But I know what it's like to let bitterness fester. You didn't poison her, but you saw the trap and stepped aside. He didn't answer. She turned toward the door. Justice, she said, has many layers, and not all are served in court. That evening, the village bell tolled 6 times. Clouds rolled over Oakwood Ridge once again, and the quiet that returned was no longer peaceful, but reflective. At the parish hall, the cups had been packed away for good. At the vicarage, Lydia Farrow resumed her duties, quieter, steadier, more cautious, and at Mrs. Groves's home, the silver-plated spoon had been taken down from the mantel. Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, knitting in hand, radio turned low. Radio turned low. Her tea steamed beside her, faintly floral, exactly as she liked it. A letter lay open on the table. It was from Inspector Harwood. The post-mortem confirms digitalis. The residue matches the cracked cup. Mrs. Groves confessed in full. Crowthorne's inheritance is uncontested, for now. Lydia has been cleared. Justice, as you said, wears many faces. Thank you, Miss Marple. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the teapot. Then she leaned back, watching the fire curl around the logs. Letitia Blackwood had ruled with sharp eyes and sharper words. Her death was not mourned, not truly, but in the end, even tyrants leave shadows. And sometimes it is not the poison that kills, but the bitterness that invited it. Chapter 8. The village might have believed the matter was over, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that conclusions reached too quickly were often the wrong ones, or at least incomplete. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, watching the pattern of the steam rise, then fade. Outside her window, spring rain tapped faintly at the glass, and the garden glistened with the kind of damp that soaked into the bones. A knock at the door came mid-morning. It was Lydia Farrow. She stood nervously, her coat soaked at the shoulders, cheeks flushed from wind. I know you said I was cleared," she stammered, "but something's still bothering me." Miss Marple gestured her inside and set the kettle on again. Lydia clutched her handbag tightly. "The cup I dropped. The one I switched at the tea. I've been thinking about it. It wasn't the chipped one." Miss Marple looked up. "What do? You mean I dropped the one with the tiny hairline crack? But when I picked up the tray earlier, before everything happened, the one meant for Daniel, his usual, was already missing." A long pause followed. Miss Marple's voice was low. "Already missing?" "Yes," Lydia said. "I didn't think about it then. I assumed Mrs. Groves had set it aside to be washed. But now, after everything, I don't know." Miss Marple rose, took her notebook from the mantel, and turned back several pages. Her eyes narrowed. Then the cup Mrs. Groves poisoned, the one in the storeroom, might not have been the poisoned one at all. Lydia blinked. But then where's the real one? Within the hour, Miss Marple was at the parish hall again. This time she examined the tea crates herself, gloved, methodical. She found 3 chipped cups, all documented in Mrs. Groves's cleaning records. 2 were consistent with accidental damage over time. The third was different. It bore a fracture running along the inner rim, so thin it was almost invisible unless angled against the light. And yet there was no poison residue on it. None at all. She turned it over. The maker's stamp read, "Winchester Ware, 1927. Then she inspected the cup found in the storeroom, the one the police had tested. Winchester Ware, 1931, 4 years apart. Different batch, different cup." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a line. Someone had swapped the real poisoned cup for a different one after the murder, and it hadn't been Mrs. Groves. At the vicarage, she met with Inspector Harwood once more. He reviewed the manufacturing dates and glaze patterns on the 2 cups, then looked up at her, brow furrowed. "So, the one we tested was not the poisoned cup at all," Miss Marple said. "It was planted to direct suspicion. A decoy." Harwood frowned. "But Groves confessed." "She confessed to the attempt, yes, but the cup she used was never recovered. Someone else removed it. Someone who knew how to mislead the investigation, just enough to allow the truth to hide beneath a convenient lie." "Crowthorne?" Miss Marple paused. "No," she said softly. "Crowthorne saw the danger, but didn't create it. He used the chaos for his benefit, but he didn't manipulate the evidence." Harwood sat back. "Then who?" Miss Marple closed her notebook. "I think it's time I visited Reverend Barnes." The vicar welcomed her with his usual warmth. ushering her into the study where theological volumes shared shelves with gardening books, loose parish newsletters. "I suppose this is about Mrs. Groves?" he asked. "In part," Miss Marple said, "but more about the items found afterward, the teacup specifically." "Ah," he nodded, "an unfortunate business." "Yes, especially since it wasn't the right one." The vicar blinked. "I don't follow." The cracked teacup in the storeroom, Winchester ware, 1931, was from the backup set, but the one missing from the tray. Winchester ware, 1927. It was part of the original commemorative batch, rarely used. It had a faint crest on the base, a detail few would notice, unless they had a habit of cataloguing the parish's inventory. The vicar's face froze for just a second too long. "Missive," Marple continued gently. "You see, Reverend, when Lydia returned the hymn book to you that evening, she said you were surprised, that she'd forgotten it entirely. But the book was never hers to borrow. You left it in the parish hall. You went back after the tea." Itodioshin said nothing. "You found the poisoned cup, or perhaps saw something during the event, a suspicious gesture, an unattended tray, and instead of alerting the police, you removed the original teacup and replaced it with one from the damaged set." Still, he didn't respond. Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "Why?" Reverend Barnes finally sighed. "Because I knew Mrs. Groves had done it, or tried to, and I knew she'd break under the weight of her conscience. But if the police had tested the original cup, the charges might have been more severe. Premeditated, I thought. If it appeared sloppy, careless, perhaps she'd be spared the worst." Miss Marple studied him. "Mercy," she said at last, "a rare motive. She served this village for 20 years. She never meant to kill Letitia. She meant to scare Crowthorne, force him to leave, nothing more. But someone died." "No," he said quietly, "and I will answer for it in my own way." Miss Marple rose and placed her gloves into her handbag. "You've already started," she said, "and I suspect that will be enough." Chapter 9. For most of Oakwood Ridge, the storm had passed. Mrs. Groves remained under house arrest, awaiting formal charges. Lydia Farrow had returned to her quiet duties, her shoulders lighter, though she still looked over them when crossing a room. Daniel Crowthorne resumed his legal work, though villagers now crossed the street to avoid him, politeness trimmed with wariness. But for Miss Marple, the case felt unfinished. She had closed more murders than most would care to count, and yet something about this one nagged at her, something beyond Mrs. Groves, beyond Reverend Barnes's gentle interference. It lingered in the silence between cups, in the exactness of the setup, in the question that no one had asked. Why poison Daniel Crowthorne at all? It had always been assumed he was the target, cold, opportunistic, and widely suspected of manipulating Letitia Blackwood. But Miss Marple now realized he was only the obvious choice, not the inevitable one. She returned to her garden bench with a notebook and a question. What if the motive hadn't been revenge? What if it had been protection? That evening she asked Inspector Harwood to join her for supper. He arrived with a small bag of scones and the same sceptical brow he always wore when Miss Marple used the word possibility. "You said you found something," he prompted. "I believe we've all been looking in the wrong direction," Miss Marple said. "Or rather, only in one direction, toward who planned the poisoning." He paused mid-scorn. "And we didn't ask who discovered it before it happened." He frowned. "You think someone intercepted the plan?" "Yes," she said, "and redirected it." She reached for her notebook and laid it open. The cracked teacup was already missing before the event began. Lydia assumed Mrs. Groves had moved it, but I believe someone else discovered the plan, possibly through an overheard conversation, a misplaced letter, or even an open cupboard, and decided to let the plan unfold. With a twist, Harwood sat back. "You're suggesting a second hand was involved, not just an accident of misswitched cups." "I'm suggesting the cup never mattered," Miss Marple replied softly. "It was the symbol, the message. Someone wanted Letitia Blackwood dead, not by intent, but by permission." Harwood's voice lowered. "Who?" Miss Marple tapped her pen gently. "Letitia Blackwood's cousin. The one no one noticed. The one who stayed silent at the funeral. The one who had the clearest path to both the poisoned cup and the inheritance." Until now, few had spoken of Muriel Trent. A cousin by marriage, she lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the Blackwood estate. She received a modest allowance, enough to live, but not enough to thrive. She attended teas only occasionally, and when she did, she spoke little and listened well. Miss Marple paid her a visit on a Thursday morning. The garden was neat but over-pruned, and the curtains twitched slightly before the door opened. "Miss Marple," Muriel said, surprised but pleasant. "How thoughtful of you." They sat in the parlour, where the air smelled faintly of mothballs and violets. The fireplace was unlit. On the wall hung two portraits, Letitia Blackwood and a much younger Muriel, smiling tightly, like a woman who hadn't done it often. "I heard you've been unwell since the funeral," Miss Marple began. Muriel nodded. "I've had a headache that simply won't go." Miss Marple poured the tea. "You must have been quite close to Letitia." Muriel blinked. "Close? I wouldn't say that." "No?" Miss Marple said gently. "But you lived only a quarter-mile away. And yet she never mentioned you." Muriel said nothing. "I found that odd," Miss Marple continued, "until I realized you weren't meant to be seen. You were tolerated, kept, not trusted." Muriel's cup rattled against her saucer. "You knew about Mrs. Groves's plan," Miss Marple said, voice low. "You overheard something, saw something, and rather than stop it, you nudged it, just slightly, enough to make sure Letitia was the one who drank from that cup." "That's a terrible accusation," Muriel whispered. "It's not an accusation," Miss Marple said. "It's an observation. The kind of thing one notices when the quietest woman in the room shows up at the parish hall earlier than anyone else, then leaves before tea is even served. No one noticed. No one ever notices you, do they?" Muriel's eyes brimmed. "She called me useless," she whispered. "All my life, a barnacle. I served her tea, fetched her pills, and in the end she left me a collection of porcelain dogs, and £20 a year. You didn't poison her," Miss Marple said, "but you knew someone else would." Muriel nodded. "Once. And you said nothing." Tears streaked her cheeks now. "Does that make me a killer?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It makes you human." Later that night, Miss Marple stood once again by her fire, the embers glowing low. She reviewed the names, the shifting motives, the sequence of cups and conversations, and then she closed the notebook. The case wasn't about tea, it was about resentment, about those who remained invisible long enough to learn how power worked, about women told for decades they were nothing, until they believed it, and then acted, not with violence, but with silence. Chapter 10. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple hosted what she described innocently as a thank-you tea for those involved in the spring parish event. The invitation was handwritten, modest, and unmistakably warm, just as Miss Marple intended. The drawing-room of her cottage was set with care. A fire flickered gently in the grate, fresh hydrangeas brightened the window-sill, and the tea service was arranged on a walnut sideboard with 3 distinct cups, one with a fine gold rim, one with a blue floral band, and one with a faint fracture on its underside, deliberately placed face down. Miss Marple waited as her guests arrived exactly as predicted. Mrs. Groves, released under supervision, entered with hesitant steps. She looked older than she had a week ago. Her apron was folded neatly over her arm, as if muscle memory refused to let her arrive without it. Lydia Farrow came second, clutching a wrapped sponge cake, eyes flicking nervously between Miss Marple and the hearth. Daniel Crowthorne arrived last, freshly shaved, posture perfect, a polite half-smile ready on cue. And then, of course, Muriel Trent. She entered silently, eyes sweeping the room in a glance so fast most wouldn't have noticed it. But Miss Marple did, and she watched the flicker in Muriel's gaze as it caught the fractured teacup on the sideboard, half hidden behind the sugar bowl. Miss Marple offered tea. "Help yourselves, everyone," she said sweetly. "Just a small gesture of thanks, and I've taken the liberty of laying out the cups we used at the spring tea. A bit of sentimentality." There was a pause, barely perceptible. Mrs. Groves turned toward the floral cup. Lydia reached for the gold-rimmed one. Muriel hesitated. Her hand moved halfway to the fractured cup, then stopped. Instead, she took no cup at all. "I'm not thirsty," she said almost too quickly. "My stomach's still unsettled." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Oh, but surely a little ginger biscuit would help. And a sip of mint tea, very calming for nerves." Muriel's eyes flicked again, then down. "No, really, I'll just have a seat." Daniel, unaware, had taken a scone and a cup without much thought. Lydia nibbled gingerly. Mrs. Groves poured with trembling hands. Muriel sat, hands folded too tightly, jaw locked. Miss Marple turned to her, voice pleasant as ever. "Muriel, I've always admired how quietly you move through the world. You listen more than you speak. It's a gift, really. People say things around you they wouldn't say elsewhere." Muriel looked up, guarded. "You must have noticed so much at the parish hall," Miss Marple continued. "Even the smallest details, like which cup was missing before the tea began." Lydia looked up sharply. Muriel blinked. "I never mentioned that to you," Miss Marple said, tilting her head slightly. "Only Lydia and I discussed it. And yet, you paused just now when you saw that particular cup. You recognized it." A silence bloomed in the room. "I didn't," Muriel began, then stopped. Daniel glanced between them. Mrs. Groves set her cup down with a soft clink. "I understand what it's like Miss Marple said softly. To be overlooked, to feel erased. But you must understand, choosing silence when you know a murder is about to happen is no less deliberate than speaking the words yourself. Muriel stood abruptly. I think I should go. Miss Marple didn't stop her. She simply looked down at her knitting. As the door shut, the room remained still. Only then did Lydia speak. She didn't drink anything. No, Miss Marple replied. She didn't dare. Because for her, the cup represents consequence, a fear of being exposed through her own panic. Daniel exhaled, brushing crumbs from his lap. You don't intend to turn her in. I already have, Miss Marple said. Not for murder, but for obstruction. The police will determine what that entails. Mrs. Groves, pale and hollow-eyed, looked across the room. She let me confess. She watched me fall apart. She did, Miss Marple said gently, and she will carry that silence for the rest of her life. That evening, Inspector Harwood met Miss Marple on the church path as they both walked home. She's in custody, he said, reluctantly, quietly. There won't be a trial, not a public one. Not unless Mrs. Groves insists. She won't, Miss Marple said. She'll see it as balance, a penance shared. Harwood rubbed the back of his neck. You think Muriel would have killed Letitia herself? No, Miss Marple replied. Muriel could never have acted outright. But given the opportunity to permit a death, she chose to let it happen. In her own way, that was enough. Harwood was silent for a moment. You know, I've worked in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades, and I still struggle to understand how people can rationalize these things. Miss Marple gave him a kind look. That's because you rely on what people say. I rely on what they almost say. Chapter 11. 2 days had passed since the tea gathering in Miss Marple's cottage. 2 days in which no new gossip emerged, no arrests were formally announced, and no one in Oakwood Ridge seemed willing to ask questions they didn't want answered. But Miss Marple was not quite finished. There was still one last teacup to turn over. At 10 o'clock sharp on Tuesday morning, she returned to Larkspur Hall. The grounds, once so pristine, now bore signs of gentle neglect. Overgrown roses at the gate, a shutter missing its hinge. The house, without Letitia's presence, felt like a shell still waiting for someone to fill it or sell it. Daniel Crowthorne met her at the door with a tight expression, but polite words. "You've come to see the will, I expect," he said, gesturing her inside. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not exactly, but it's good of you to assume I'm still nosy." "Habit," he said. They sat in the drawing-room, his papers spread neatly across the desk, legal correspondence in folders. The last of Letitia Blackwood's assets, reduced to numbered inventories and signatures. "I've been advised not to speak much," he said, half smiling. "The situation with Muriel is delicate." "Everything human is," Miss Marple replied. "But I'm not here to discuss Muriel." That caught his attention. He raised a brow. "Oh? No," she said. "I'm here to discuss the cup." Daniel's smile faded. "I thought we'd already settled that." "No," she said gently. "We only settled whose hand placed it, not who created the need for it. That's something else entirely." She opened her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of notepaper. "You remember this?" He glanced at it. The anonymous letter. She knew what I'd done. The cup wasn't meant for her. Miss Marple laid it on the table between them. "I reviewed it again yesterday," she said, "and something struck me. The wording, what I'd done, past tense. The cup wasn't meant for her." Passive voice. "It doesn't read like guilt over making a mistake. It reads like guilt over making a choice." He said nothing. She looked up. "You didn't poison the tea, Daniel, but you knew someone had." Still silence. "And you didn't warn Letitia because you suspected she'd survive, because you suspected the dose wasn't fatal, or more truthfully, because a part of you hoped it might be." Daniel leaned back, his voice cold. "She destroyed people, quietly, systematically. I was her ward, her puppet. Every month I signed papers for her. Every investment, every decision filtered through her. And she kept threatening to cut me out. Said I didn't deserve the firm." "She died with your signature on her financial authorization documents," Miss Marple said quietly. "And without an updated will." Daniel looked at her now, expression unreadable. Miss Marple continued. "The note wasn't a confession. It was a shield, something you planted, perhaps even wrote, in case the poison didn't work or in case it did, and you needed a fallback. It framed the act as a mistake, as an accident. Clever, but not clever enough." He stared at her, and then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She was already dying, you know. She told me herself. 2 years at most. Liver. I saw no point in speeding it up, but I also saw no point in prolonging it." Miss Marple's tone didn't change. "So you let the poisoner act. You saw the signs. You knew the cup. You may have even quietly encouraged it, but you never dirtied your hands." He stood abruptly. "I'm not confessing to anything." "You don't need to," Miss Marple replied, "because this was never about charges, Mr. Crowthorne. It was about clarity. For the village, for Lydia, and for Letitia's memory, even if flawed." He paced to the window, hands in his pockets. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave," Miss Marple said. That made him turn. "What?" "You've inherited her estate. You have her name now, her keys, her money. But you won't ever have her silence, or mine. You'll be watched from here on." "And if I don't?" She folded her gloves with practiced ease. "You've built a life on being tolerated, Daniel, not trusted. That ends today." By the end of the week, Daniel Crowthorne had quietly relocated to London. No announcement, no farewell. Miss Marple received a single letter in the post, unsigned but typed, that read, "You were right about everything. Except one thing. I did drink the tea, but it didn't kill me. Only what was left of my fear." She tucked the letter beside her notebook and closed the drawer. In Oakwood Ridge, things returned to their rhythm. The grocer reopened his shutters with confidence. The vicar resumed his sermons with more humility, and Lydia Farrar received a permanent position at the parish. But on the back shelf of the hall cupboard, behind the polished platters and scone trays, there still sat an empty space, where a single fractured teacup once belonged. Chapter 12. The garden gate creaked open just after dusk. It was Lydia Farrar. Miss Marple looked up from her chair in the fading light. Knitting paused on her lap and offered a gentle smile. "You're always welcome, my dear." Lydia hesitated in the shadow of the gate, hands deep in her cardigan pockets. I needed to ask, she said, if it's really over. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering the question. That depends what you mean by over. The danger, yes. The murder solved. But peace, that takes longer. Lydia stepped inside, the gravel path crunching softly beneath her shoes. People still look at me like I had something to do with it, she said. Even though I didn't. You were part of it, Miss Marple said, not unkindly. That's different than being guilty, but still important. Lydia looked down. I didn't mean to swap anything. I wasn't trying to draw attention. I just didn't want to be embarrassed again. I know, Miss Marple replied, and that one small decision, driven by fear, changed the course of several lives. Lydia sat on the bench beside her. So many people were involved. It wasn't just one villain. It was everyone. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as it so often is. She reached for her notebook, turning to the final page, where she'd drawn 3 columns. At the top, action, motive, consequence. Lydia glanced down. You really wrote it all out? Not to accuse, to understand. Miss Marple tapped each entry as she spoke. Mrs. Groves poisoned the cup. Intended to harm Daniel. Motive, vengeance. Consequence, unintended death. Muriel Trent discovered the plan. Chose silence. Motive, buried resentment. Consequence, Letitia's death allowed. Reverend Barnes swapped the cup after the fact. Motive, protection. Consequence, hindered justice. Daniel Crowthorne. Consequence, hindered justice. Daniel Crowthorne recognized the plan, said nothing. Motive, greed. Consequence, inheritance and exile. You switched the cups unknowingly. Motive, nerves. Consequence, a woman died. Lydia was quiet for a long time. And what about you? She asked softly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. I observed, I asked, I listened. Motive, truth. Consequence, clarity. A long silence passed between them as the breeze rustled the hedges. Do you think people will forgive me? Lydia whispered. Some already have, Miss Marple said. Others may never. That isn't yours to control. But you can be better than the worst moment you lived. Lydia blinked and wiped her eyes. I'll try. Miss Marple smiled. Then it was worth it. The next day, Inspector Harwood arrived with a folded document. An official close to the investigation, stamped and signed. The coroner's report, he said. No contest. Natural death brought on by poisoning. Circumstantial pressure from multiple actors. But only Mrs. Groves stands formally accused. Miss Marple skimmed it. And the rest? Barnes will be reprimanded. Not formally, but the diocese has been informed. Muriel's decision to withhold knowledge won't carry a charge, but she's chosen to relocate to her sisters in Yorkshire. And Crowthorne? Gone, as you requested. Miss Marple nodded. And the village? Still chattering, he admitted. But it's quieter now. Less venom. People are tired. They usually are when faced with the truth, she said. Harwood smiled faintly. You know, when I first arrived, I thought this was a straightforward case of murder. Poison, motive, cup. But it wasn't a murder mystery at all. No, Miss Marple agreed. It was a character study, with death as the mirror. He tapped the report. And what should I write in the final line? Miss Marple considered, then said quietly, Justice, imperfect but complete. That should do. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the vicarage steeple, Miss Marple sat on her back porch. She had brewed herself a fresh pot of tea, chamomile, this time no milk, and placed it in a new cup, one she'd bought herself, pale green with no hairline cracks. She lifted it slowly, watching the steam rise. It wasn't about the tea. It never had been. It was about choices, who you serve, who you protect, who you notice, and who you don't. And whether, when the cup is finally placed before you, you drink from it blindly, or stop to ask why it was offered to you in the first place. She took a sip, then turned her chair toward the garden, toward the quiet village beyond, waiting, as always, for the next silence to be broken. Chapter 13. A week later, the village had returned to its routines, but with a faint wariness, as if afraid that stirring the teacup too briskly might still reveal something unpleasant beneath the surface. At the bakery, Mrs. Jennings now offered quiet smiles without commentary. At the parish hall, the teacups had been locked away, perhaps forever. At the vicarage, Reverend Barnes spoke with a renewed softness in his voice, less certainty, more humility. No one mentioned Letitia Blackwood by name any more, but her shadow lingered, on stone paths, in whispering hedges, in the hush that followed any too sudden silence. Miss Marple visited the grave one last time. Letitia's name was etched cleanly into the marble. No epitaph, no poetry, just her name, dates, and a narrow line beneath, waiting like a pause too long. Muriel Trent had sent no flowers. Daniel Crowthorne had sent a solicitor. But Lydia Farrow had left a single pale teacup on the grave, rim chipped, base unmarked, a silent offering. Miss Marple stood there for a while, then nodded once and turned away. Back at her cottage, she tidied her notebook for the last time. She removed the pressed napkin with the tea stains, the scrappers of anonymous writing, the page of suspects she had once believed to be her final column. She added one more line beneath it all. The truth did not come from confession. It came from contradiction. That had been the final turn, not who poisoned the tea, or who drank from the wrong cup, but who noticed the wrong person drank it and said nothing. That moment of silence, shared across 4 people, was the true heartbeat of the case. The cup had cracked, but the silence had broken first. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat beneath her arbor, pruning faded roses. The garden buzzed gently with bees, and the air smelled of time and memory. A small voice came from the gate. Miss Marple? Lydia Farrow again, this time with a small parcel under her arm and a softness in her expression. "I brought you something," she said. "It's not much." She opened the parcel to reveal a teacup, plain white, not fine china, but whole. "No chips," Lydia said. "I bought it at the market. Thought it might be time to start again." Miss Marple took it with careful hands. "A new set is never quite the same as the old," she said, "but it has the advantage of being empty." Lydia smiled. "That's what I'm trying to be." Miss Marple rose and led her towards the cottage. "Come," she said, "let's have a real cup of tea. No secrets in this one." That evening, as dusk folded the village into its quiet shell, a light shone softly from Miss Marple's window. Inside there was laughter, nothing loud, but real. Lydia washed the new cups with care, and Miss Marple arranged lemon biscuits on a plate. They didn't speak of Letitia, or Daniel, or Muriel, not because they had forgotten, but because they had remembered enough. Some endings don't come with applause, just a clean cup, a steady hand, and a silence that for once doesn't need to be broken. The end.